Hey, welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I'm joined by James McNinch. I think I've got that right, but I'm going to find out in a minute whether I have or not. I should be able to do it, given my name's McDermott. So there's got to be some connection somewhere along the MC Irish connection, I imagine. So we'll be getting to know James shortly. He's what's known and just for people in the UK, he's a licensed clinical social worker, which is sort of US speak for psychotherapist, psychologist. Social worker in the UK has very different connotations. It's not a clinical post as such. But this Jim or James is a clinician from the psychological therapies background. He'll tell us more about that. We're going to be talking about some of the work that they're doing, amazing work that they're doing in and around mental health and addiction, and some new a model of practice that is going to hopefully revolutionize addiction treatment. Before we do that, just to remind you, although this looks live, it is pre-recorded, so don't call me during the show because I'll probably be doing something else and you'll get a grumpy old man as opposed to somebody very receptive. But my number, should you have any questions, is 07506 319 745. I'm just going to put my do not disturb on. I always forget that. And send me messages. James, I'm sure will leave some contact details, but if he doesn't, you can always send messages to me, and I'll pass them on to him. And I'm sure he'd be delighted to have any follow-up contact with people who are interested in his services. That's enough for me, I think, for now. Just to say, welcome, James. How you doing?
Hey Noel, great to be here. I'm doing pretty well. It's early here and
Yeah.
I missed yesterday, so I apologize for that. And I'm here today, grateful to be here.
You're
And
having some important celebrations with a family member who's achieving some amazing milestones. So that's great. Family comes first, always, I think, without a doubt, in my book. It's got to have a balance there, haven't we, about what's important in life?
yeah, I think especially in the work that we do, it's my family and connections allow me to have a greater capacity in all the work that I do.
Yeah.
That I have to have a place to go regroup, and definitely family is a huge part of that. Yeah.
And I think, it is important in our work, as you say, to walk the walk. So it's like, unfortunately, a lot in our profession don't. They do tend to burn themselves out. Compassion fatigue, I'm sure, is a term that you're aware of. Certainly here in the UK, in the NHS and social services, people um, go to work when they shouldn't. When they should be taking time off. They don't allow themselves to be ill. They don't allow themselves to recharge. And it's a common thing, I think, globally amongst healthcare and social care professionals to overexert themselves. So I think it's a really important point to make, isn't it? That we have to look after ourselves. Where is here? You said it's early here. Where is that?
I'm in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States.
Great. So that's on the eastern seaboard, is that right?
Very close, yes, right there near Canada. We're about 3 miles from Canada, right here in
Yeah.
Detroit.
And it's ex industrial town. I don't think it's industrial town now, is it? Very famous for music, I seem to remember.
That's right. Yeah, Motown. Yep.
Yeah. But it used to be a big sort of car factory place at one point, didn't it?
Absolutely. Ford GM is global auto manufacturer hub, and now it's has a renaissance going on. It kind of turned into a place that was a bit dilapidated after industry, and now it has a renaissance going on where it's coming back alive. So it's really fun to watch. Yeah.
Great, great. And is that where you're from originally, James?
Yes, that's where I'm from originally. I've lived out in Los Angeles for, decades and kind of split my time between Austin, Florida, Detroit, and Los Angeles right now. That's what I do.
Yeah, I mean it's I don't think people who haven't been I've been to the US several times and it's massive. It's absolutely huge. I hesitate to call it one country. It isn't really. It's like a lot of different countries that all loosely cooperate at times. And the cultures are very, very different from state to state and place to place. So California's Los Angeles is very different from the East Coast or the Midwest, etc. So tell me about what was it like growing up in Detroit? I mean, the sort of I'm guessing you have some sort of Irish connection with that name.
Yes, my grandfather on my mom's side was Hickey, which was Irish, Scottish, and English, and then on my father's side is McNinch, and that was Irish, Scottish, and English.
Yeah,
And basically on my dad's side, there were I think coal miners that came over here and got busy doing that. It's pretty rough go. And then
yeah,
on my mom's side, my grandfather was like a physician. He lost both his parents and was in an orphanage for like a long time and eventually emancipated himself, and the Navy paid for him to go to medical school. And so
right.
he had kind of all the resources and kind of privilege on one side of my family. And then on the other side, it was very rough going working class,
Yeah.
that kind of life. Yeah.
So sort of family that did that American dream, as it were, came in as immigrants and have established themselves and developed, and the siblings, the children have had a better life than the parents. That sort of almost ideal immigrant story, really, in some ways.
Almost, I think that they were just so busy trying to survive that whether they were highly successful or not, that no one kind of really dealt with anything. And so I think, stories of my grandfather being the director of Mass General, but waking up in a phone booth, 2 hours outside of Boston and not knowing how he got there.
Right.
People tell me that story, I would be like, that sounds
Sounds like a
maybe
blackout
like,
to me.
yeah, yeah.
I think alcohol might be involved in that one somewhere.
I don't know how I got here. It's the
Yeah.
strangest thing.
And I think also from that background as well, historically, my parents were both came from Ireland to England. And again, similar story in the sense of they wanted better for their children. Ireland was a very poor country at the time. And so that made sense. And that happened, but also that history of intergenerational violence and trauma and addiction, etc., is there. And this generation carry that and have to make choices about how they carry that or not. So similar, I guess, similar type story. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the intergenerational component is just so deep and
Yeah.
profound. And then also to the cultural aspects of where we come from also make up a lot of what I see as far as, who's coming into treatment and how to, some things are the same in a lot of aspects. And then there's also cultural aspects. I think that that's what I love about our model is it takes those things into account that
Right.
Dr. Heller and I developed. It's just it's so nuanced that allows a lot of space for whatever's happening right now.
Well,
And
briefly tell us, give us the headlines on the model, and then we'll go back in time a little bit and see your how you got to this point and why you understand it. Because certainly, I would say in my practice, who I am has informed how I work very directly in my own personal history and the journey that I've been on, without a doubt. So, firstly, tell us about the model. What's it called and what's its components and who is it aimed at for?
sure, it's called the Neuroaffective Relational Model, or
Okay.
NARM is kind of the acronym, but it's the addiction-centered version of it. It's been around since about 2012.
So,
So
neuro being brain, personality, affective, emotional.
and affective is, it's kind of top down, bottom up. So it takes into account like the affect, the overall attunement with the body as far
Okay.
as like posture, muscle tension. So it's looking at things somatically, but it's also looking at things, neurologically, which is kind of psychobiological, is
Yeah.
what we call it.
Okay.
And it was developed by Dr. Lawrence Heller, who helped develop somatic experience with Peter Levine. So it's kind of the jump up because Peter's basically top up only. It all comes from the body. That's kind of a very popular thing. But I think something that doesn't take
So
in.
Levine wrote the book about animals shaking to reduce trauma. That's how he's known, very famous as a trauma doctor and psychotherapist, I guess. He was also a psychiatrist, wasn't he? So uh,
Absolutely.
was it no, it wasn't The Body Remembers, it was what was the book he wrote that was very popular?
Oh, that's Bessel van der Kolk. The body keeps the
Yeah, The
score.
Body Keeps Score is Bessel. And Levine, the one with the animals, the tigers, was what was that called?
Waking the Tiger.
Yes, that's it. A very famous book. I was lucky once. I happened to be on the East Coast, and there was a large psychotherapy conference going on as I was visiting Disney World in Florida. So I thought, why not? It sort of
Wow.
made sense at the time,
Yeah.
Disney World psychotherapy conference. Oh, okay. But Levine and Van der Kolk were both there,
Oh,
along
wow.
with other. It was like that. It was sort of where one was like, okay, that was lucky. So Levine is a trauma-based person who looks at the body and, like you say, from bottom up to top, how the body. And I think was it Levine or Van der Kolk that looked at things like the back brain and the activation in the back brain and using balancing exercises and games to help develop trauma therapy so that you're using the back brain, the autonomic functioning, distracting it, as it were, so you can do. They were doing those types of experiments, I think, weren't they?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yes.
And that's where all that sort of surfing therapy comes from with, and it makes absolute sense. You're balancing and then you do psychotherapy afterwards and all that sort of stuff. So, um, but your model is coming more from the top down. So explain that a bit more to me. What does that mean?
Well, it's an equal balance of it,
Okay.
that it's all one organism. That's the kind of way, like, if you have cognitive-based therapies, in the third wave tradition of psychotherapies, and then you move into stuff like EMDR, which is kind of
Just explain to
non-traditional.
people third wave what that means, because it's
Well,
a non-specialist audience, really.
okay, so if you're looking at psychotherapies, you're looking at the psychosexual models, right, as kind of the basis of
That
things.
would be Freud and then Jung and people like that. All right.
Exactly. And then you kind of move into more behavioralists in the second. And then third, you move into what's called the cognitive base, so you have cognitive based therapies, less psychodynamic. And then now you're looking at things like EMDR,
Yeah.
eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which basically replicates REM sleep, let's
Yeah.
say,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and to process things. But the fifth wave, as far as like neuroaffective relational model, it's taking a new approach
Yeah.
into how we process trauma. It's looking at less of shock trauma, which EMDR treats, and it's looking more at relational trauma.
Yeah.
It's what
What we used
happened.
to call developmental trauma.
Exactly. Developmental trauma, you could call it relational trauma. There's a few different terms for it these days, but it's what happened inside of you in the presence of others.
So let's just drill that down and explain that or pull it apart a little bit for people. So shock trauma or shock traumatic events would be typically, you understand it, people, somebody's in a car crash, they're in a war zone, there's an overwhelming presence of death and stress. And then the mind can't quite process that. And you have these ways of coping, if you like, intrusive thinking, problems with sleep, drinking too much, relational problems, then various dissociative states, derealization, project, all that sort of stuff, right? I mean, that comes from what people would understand as understandably traumatic. Okay.
Yes.
You see death, you see horrible things. Okay. But this developmental trauma has been a growing understanding about that. And so, can you explain a bit more about relational trauma? Because it's not an event, is it? It's something else is
No.
going on.
Yeah, that's a very deep question. And what I would say is in our model, we explain it as under the umbrella of complex trauma, that's what complicates later in terms of current events and past events, that people that have things like personality disorders and extreme characterological issues, that they kind of vacillate in between these states of being. And so how does that happen? I think it's exactly what you're saying, Noel. It's developmental. So developmental trauma, what happened inside of them in the presence of extreme environmental failure,
Yeah.
how they adapted to that, and that adaptation affected them in terms of jumping around to adaptive states to kind of match their caregiver to avoid relational loss. And when they grow up, that's why they're extremely dysregulated, because it doesn't match relationships out here.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't match work environments. And so a lot of our work is
Again, do
based
you
on,
mind if I interrupt a little bit just to
yeah,
sort of add some thoughts to it. So one of the criticisms, for example, of borderline personality disorder as a diagnosis is that it seems to be given to a lot of women. And then when you talk to those women, you find out that they've had a lot of relational trauma, they had sexual trauma as children, they had abuse, they had et cetera, et cetera. And then we began to question, I guess, whether the diagnosis was correct, but actually it was just an adaptation that was understandable within the framing of trauma experiences or this developmental trauma or the type of trauma that you and I are talking about right now. Does that make sense? Is that
Absolutely. And that will bring when we go into addiction, looking at social models, how men and women are socialized, different in terms of antisocial stuff in jails, and then women more, acting in versus acting things out, that there's different ways, not because we're different, just because I believe it's the way we're socialized.
yeah,
And
it's
that,
not genetic, it's
right.
social and cultural, environmental factors. And I guess we both share an understanding that environment is more important than anything else anyway, that and particularly trauma because biology adapts to that environment. And there's a two-way process going on there. So so I think that explains it, what we're looking at. We'll look at more in depth about addiction and understanding that because there is quite clear evidence, for example, if you start drinking too young, you're effectively doing the same to your brain as trauma because you're destroying that capacities to manage and regulate. And so that's one way of understanding addiction, certainly alcoholism, and I presume substance misuse. So this is all very interesting, but how on earth did you get involved in all of this stuff? Like, what did you do wrong in a previous life to be doing this?
Well, Noel, very early on, I had my own issues. I was in the court systems and things like that. And
Okay. And are you okay to talk about those things?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, cool.
That's all.
Anytime you feel uncomfortable, you just say, we stop the conversation. It's fine. You don't need to explain yourself. Just look after yourself.
Yeah, one thing is I'm not an expert. In our model, we try not to look at I'm the, doctor and they're the patient. It's very much
Yeah,
a collaboration. So I think if I
absolutely.
can show someone my capacity, that allow them to have their own capacity too, and there's no hierarchy there.
Yeah, yeah, great.
So,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
so I'd say, yeah, I was in the court system very young. I had the privilege to go into psychotherapy very early,
Yeah.
around the age of 11. And I was actually treated by one of the co-founders of EMDR, a guy named Richard Spates at Michigan State University.
Wow.
And he was one of the first guys who actually started using EMDR in 1991. So I was one of the first people that actually did EMDR. So I knew that no matter how tough stuff got in my personal life and in my family life as a child, I always felt something was okay. And I believe that's because I got in touch with something extremely at depth within myself in these EMDR sessions.
Yes.
And it preserved part of me to later on and go do things that I think a lot of people who had my experience might not be able to do.
I think that's really interesting. I'm thinking about my own experience of life. I grew up in a lot of violence, addiction, etc. And my sense of where I got that from were two places. One, I was very much involved in the arts and theatre in particular. And secondly, I was very good at school. And school and those in the arts had a reparative function in my life, which I think gave me a good enough sense of self to mean that I wasn't institutionalized, to be honest. Sort of, although I did develop alcoholism as a coping mechanism and so on and so forth, but there are consequences for that sort of childhood, really. So, but that's how I relate to that because I'm slightly older than you. So it was prior to that, I was still second wave therapy was available, which actually wasn't that effective for what I was going through.
Ah, yeah, the relational aspects, that we both struggle with that. I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, yeah,
And
that's okay. That's okay. So you had a sort of internal push and experience that I guess made you interested in the subject, and particularly the experience of having help, I imagine.
I mean, not really. I went into the sciences very early,
Okay.
so I barely passed high school. I'm not sure what you guys call it over there, but I barely passed that. And
Yeah.
kind of scam my way into college, but I ended up getting into college and I ended up working in tech for a long time. I worked for the Microsoft Corporation. We did,
Okay.
things like data centers and Xbox and a lot of hardware and software stuff. And it
Right.
was great. I made a lot of money, had fun. It was like a giant playland, to go do this stuff. And my drinking habit really got out of control.
So
And
I can imagine, yes.
right?
Yeah,
Just had
yeah.
all the fun and I never dealt with anything. And so it started coming up where it was kind of a fun drunk, and then next thing you know, it was quite antisocial. And there's this kind of rage within me and this kind of shutdown and collapse and
Yeah.
need for just intensity and all this stuff. And I ended up getting fired from there because I missed a very important email, and I damaged a big relationship with that
Right.
company.
Right.
Um, I was homeless for a while after that. I didn't really care to. I just liked to have a lot of money and a place to drink. That was kind of my goal. And you
Right.
know, so I ended up heading to treatment, and I got sober around 2007. The whole market over here started to change and everything. And
Yeah.
um, I worked for a 12-step publication company, kind of doing the editing and stacking books and learning how to be around people again. Like I could be around people if I was drinking, but if I didn't have any alcohol, I could barely talk.
Oh,
And
no.
yeah, I was just quiet for
It's so
about a year.
disabling. Isolated drinking is so disabling. And we
Yeah,
sort of miss out on all those everyday build-up of interpersonal skills and intrapersonal skills. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. And, I ended up answering phones at the office there
Right.
for, I don't know, years. And I got my supervisor who, wasn't a big fan of therapists said, you'd be like a really good drug and alcohol counselor. And so
Okay.
I kind of looked into that. And after a while, I went back to graduate school and studied at Arizona State University and, had a really great education. I interned at the University of Arizona Medical Center. And so I was a crisis social worker. There's hardly any per capita mental health spending. So they let you do everything there. They give you a car, you go out on your own, you don't have any supervision. And I got to have all this autonomy to kind of and study what I want. I went and hung out with Bessel van der Kolk and I started
Right.
talking to all these people and I started working in the trauma-informed care models that really helped me, like EMDR, and I started training in them and training other people. And I started building kind of these community mental health agencies and organizations and helping to train people in some of these newer wave therapies. So we weren't just looking at behaviors and cognitions in terms of people drinking and then kind of sending them to AA, which
Yeah.
is a wonderful thing, saved my life. And you know, uh, what I had some really good success. I had really good outcomes.
Yeah.
And I'm out in the desert there, I don't know what it is in Celsius, but it's hot summers. I mean, just it's just terrible. It's terrible to live there in the summer. Sorry, I love Arizona. It's a beautiful place, but it's just, I mean,
I drove through the deserts in America. I drove across America once, and I can
oh, okay.
agree they are hellish.
So you know
I
very
remember
well.
stopping at gas stations to get some petrol, as we would call it, gas, and you would call it, and going from the nice environment inside the car where it's relatively cool, stepping
Yeah.
outside and thinking I'm going to die immediately.
That's it.
That's
That's,
like
I mean, the
the body
oppressive
just
heat.
goes into massive shock in that sort of heat. Yeah,
Oh my God, it's dangerous, it's
yeah,
oppressive. So working with people down there in life or death situations, I was a crisis social worker, but I also helped develop, train, and I oversaw like a lot of clinics where they were bringing in kids where their parents were just deported,
yeah,
and they're a group of small children, and they wouldn't see their parents for months, and so I'd take custody and help with the situation.
yeah,
Get resources. We had a lot of the people from the Iraqi war, the State Department, that's where they sent the Iraqi refugees or the people coming across the border who were coming in through that oppressive heat. So it was a lot of humanity. I saw a lot of humanity and what it means to suffer.
yeah,
And addiction was a big part of that as far as what was helping these people get through a lot of things
yeah, yeah,
are,
absolutely.
are that are inhuman. And so creating these newer care models, training in DBT and all these great things, we started to have some good success. And I got a call from Malibu, which is a great place. It's nice and sunny and not too hot, ocean and all that. And these treatment centers out there, these owners, it wasn't the clinical directors, it was the owners saying, "Hey, we hear like you do a lot with a little. You're having good treatment outcomes with these people with addiction and trauma. Like we don't have any of that stuff."
Yeah.
This is very early days, and they said we're getting sued a lot because our patients are paying a lot of money and they're dying, or they're coming back in a lot and then they're
No, I
dying.
mean, without getting onto a soapbox about it, the sort of that Hollywood Malibu approach, there are
Yeah,
definitely limits, that drying out approach. But it is a problem, I think. There's a difference, not a problem, but there is a big difference between, say, the UK community-based model and the US institution-based model. And how do you support people in that transition and all of that sort of stuff? So I can understand why they would want you. And the way you're describing your work is very familiar to me, being in the UK. That's literally what we do. And I come from a background that's called asset-based multi-systems approach, which is it's that stuff really, and that was developed as we closed down institutions in the UK in the 80s and 90s, and we moved to a community care model. So I was sort of very familiar. And I remember when I went to Malibu and visited these places, wonderful people, but it was like, but what's next, because it was like there needed to be some sort of bridge between the sort of 12-step model and the treatment model that was unavailable. And that, okay, so people were offering secondary, tertiary care, and you could spend the rest of your life in soap houses if you wanted, but it's like, is that really living? One wonders. So there's a question there I have, really. So make a lot of money from it, but how satisfying it. So you went to Malibu. That must have been quite a culture shock for you.
yeah, very much. I mean, you go from, you know, infinite needs and finite resources to
Yeah,
all the resources in the world and I went from having 40 clients at any time to 3 to 6.
yeah,
And I could spend as much time with them. And so I really got to kind of massage out like what good treatment would be,
yeah,
really slowing things down and looking at outcomes. And so, we partner with institutes like University of Southern California, like
yeah,
teaching a lot of their master levels therapists and supervising them.
yeah.
And so I started training them in EMDR and all these things.
And were you
And
doing the assisted psychotherapy using psychedelics, etc.? Did you get involved in that as well?
well, that's a good question. In 2015, there was a guy named Dr. Smalls, and he started using ketamine off label in Texas at the University of Texas. Problem is, you get arrested there, right? And so he came out to Santa Barbara
Yeah,
and he heard I kind of had these like really far gone cases of treatment resistant people with depression and addiction. And so I thought, there's this rule in California and the ethics that if it's not, if somebody's going to die anyway, let's say, or if they're severely treatment resistant, you can send them to do something illegal if it's ethical.
yeah. Which makes sense, I think. It sort of, to me, that does make sense. Although it's open to abuse, but I think it does make sense, really. And as long as there's appropriate guardrails around the clinician making the decision, I guess.
Well, I watched people do that for a long time. I've never done it myself, but there was, I think it kind of cultivates something and it's shutting down the nervous system to get to self. But I think that there is a very pleasurable effect and that can be abused. I really am fascinated. I go to Switzerland a lot and I watch people do these, extremely powerful psychedelics, like 10,000 times more powerful than even ayahuasca, like these things like iboga and Syrian rue,
Yeah.
you know. I watch it and I can't believe what I see sometimes. It's not the magic bullet, but I think it's an accelerant to get to self.
That's the evidence, isn't it? It accelerates a process and it can relax a patient enough for the therapy to work. It's that sort of thing. So the defenses, these really deep defenses against connection with another person, can be lax enough to allow somebody in. But that somebody coming in really needs to know what they're doing. And so just be careful, folks. Don't go down to Camden Town and buy a bag of mushrooms. That's not how this works. Okay. Well, I
Right.
say that because I've had a patient did that. And then ended up in hospital having to have their system flushed out. So these are all very controlled things, folks. They are medically controlled and supervised. So don't experiment on your own. But you're not against the use of psychedelics, I guess, if you can see an ethical route and appropriate safeguards.
I mean, at first I was a strictly abstinence-based guy.
Yeah,
Uh, and the ketamine stuff did open my mind a little bit, but these further plant-based medicines are just I think it's medicine.
yeah.
I really do. And I don't think it's the magic bullet. I think that the attachment, the sociological stuff, the integration of these things have to be done to kind of heal the attachment. But I see people come in and they're like, I'm gonna get my kids back. I'm gonna stop drinking. I'm gonna take this night, and tomorrow I'm gonna be another
And it's
person.
not going to happen that way, no.
And yeah, and then what I see is that they fall off quicker into their bottom, but then they bounce back faster.
Yeah.
They actually things get worse faster because they see everything about themselves and yet they don't change it, and that gets extremely painful.
Okay. Really interesting. So let's come back to your model. So we get some sense of where you're coming from. This is part of your growth and development. You suddenly have resources, so you can think, well, okay, I've got this magic wand called money. Let's see what I can do with it. And you start playing about with that. So what was the next step for you? Where did that lead you to in terms of getting to this model of practice now?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's what you said earlier, that connection isn't safe, that connection's a threat.
Yeah,
So that's when I really started to learn about relational trauma. That a colleague of mine passed me in 2013, they passed me Dr. Heller's book and said, everything you're doing is great, but you really got to read this.
really? Okay,
And,
great.
and so I read it and it blew my mind. I thought, oh my God, like
What's the
this.
name of the book so people might be able to read it?
Yes, it's called Healing Developmental Trauma by Dr. Lawrence Heller, my business partner and co-author. And so I read it in 2013. I thought, my God, like this is the way to reorganize attachment, because that's what I researched in graduate school
Yeah.
is, reorganizing attachment. I work with Stephen Farnfeld, that he studies attachment at University of Roehampton in the UK, and he was kind of my mentor in studying attachment.
Yeah.
And so this guy actually had a solution for how to reorganize that
I should
relation.
say to people that my view is if we don't do that work around attachment, we're not achieving very much because attachment is the capacity to form meaningful relationships with other people going forwards. So
Right.
you can do the treatment for going backwards, and that can be brilliant. But if you don't have that ability to form safe bonds with other human beings, you're not really going to get very far, which is, I guess you would agree with that.
Absolutely. I think it's the foundation of human existence
Yeah.
and positive outcomes.
Yeah.
It's, if you look at, early attachment work, Ed Tronick looking at the still face experiment, things like that at Harvard, all that stuff is all about coordinating with the caregiver. Physical movement, voice inflection, all that stuff promotes positive outcomes in the world and feeling safe in the world.
Yeah.
So if the child knows that there's that connection is a threat, but yet they have to stay connected, that core dilemma puts them in impossibility.
Yeah, the
And so I
frozen
think,
attachment model, etc. So yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
and so that's where later on the strategies of living in that disconnection from the self
Sure.
create the need for self-medication. So I look at addiction as a strategy. And Bill Wilson and all that stuff, he had interesting ideas about this later in life
Yeah.
that really speak to me. And and
I
and and
think the later Bill speaks to me, the earlier one I'm like a bit wary of, to be honest.
right.
And he had his own issues, and that book he produced, I know it's supposed to be collaborative, but actually he wrote it. Is really it's in process. It shouldn't have been written. I don't think it should be a core text to anything, to be honest. It's problematic, really problematic in what it encodes about his experiences because he hadn't healed. And later
No.
on he did, I think. He became much kinder and much more stable in 65 and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, yeah. But I guess he didn't have the help we had. So there you go.
I think looking at alcoholic addiction as this biological problem or addiction or process addiction as this thing we got to get rid of or reductionism.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
It's not looking at the mechanism of what the addiction's trying to heal or the strategies from early life that it's trying to make connection without the threat of engaging with people. That,
yeah. And also, there's some strong beliefs and theories. I'm not sure how much evidence for it, but it sort of intuitively makes sense that, in this intergenerational sense, the addiction is a gift because the other option from the intergenerational trauma is suicide or despair, and addiction is an obsession with being alive. Although it's bizarre to look at, you think somebody's trying to kill themselves, but actually, it's an obsession with trying to survive, isn't it? So,
that's a
uh,
beautiful way of saying it.
yeah. And so it is in that sense a gift. And I agree with you. I think we need to understand it rather than say, it's an illness, we must get rid of it. It's actually, and certainly my experience of drinking was that I probably would have killed myself without it because the help wasn't available. And with the constellation of symptoms I was managing, it was part of the management strategy. It then had its own consequences, but it did have support and help for me for a while. So I would agree with your sort of framing. And so you're doing this, you're seeing these things, you're reading this book. It's confirming what you know as a frontline or coalface social worker, that people heal with each other in good relationships. That's where we're going to. That it's in life that we genuinely grow, and it's about making that better and giving people the tools to do that. Okay.
That,
Um,
that's totally right, Noel. And I'd say like the language that's offered in the relational model with the therapist, it's more of a relationship. That's why it's called a relational model. So it's about speaking and coordinating and sharing in synchrony and attunement
yeah,
with what's happening. And once that starts happening, they start experiencing phenomena. They start dissociative defenses, things like that start to lower addiction to intensity
yeah,
of kind of being chatty and kind of cognitive based. It starts to slow everything down.
yeah,
And what I would see in the chair in Malibu is once I started studying this model and training in it, my patients would look at me a lot of times and say, "What's happening?"
yeah,
And I could look back and say, "That's you."
yeah, 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 absolutely. Yes, yes. Lovely.
And once they got a taste of that, they didn't want to drink from any other cup. Because even if they left rehab and went and drank or used crystal meth or used opiates, whatever would happen, they couldn't forget that.
Yeah,
And they would come back into treatment so much faster,
yeah,
which, if a lot of people come out that, they spend $300,000 in treatment, their husband would spend all that money and, all these people would be cheerleading and saying, you're going to do great coming out of here. These kind of positive pop psychologists, you're
yeah,
going to do great. And they'd be like, wow, I'm going to do great. And they'd leave and they'd relapse secretly and it'd go on for a while. And then all of a sudden, they'd lose another job.
yeah,
They'd be in a hotel room or whatever, and their husband would be like, "You got to go back." But it would be like a year or two later, and they would have so much more exposure to fatality. Versus if I looked at him and he's looking at me, and I'd say, "It's okay. You're going to use like it's okay," and they're like,
and
"You
there's
you
there's
you're,
also
you're telling me this? You
yeah,
you're
there's
you're,
something
you're
there, I
telling me this?"
think. I
Yeah.
can ask you a question, I think, which I think is an interesting question, because I think often post-treatment is about relapse prevention and one understands why. But is really relapse prevention living? Is it genuinely embracing a meaningful life if that's what the tools that you have? And you seem to be suggesting something else, that it's not about that, that it's about something else. What would be that something else you're suggesting?
Authenticity. And I know
Okay.
that that's a word that is used a lot, but what I'm talking about is when somebody kind of lives up here and they're kind of just doing stuff and efforting at their life and they can't feel the foreclosed emotions that are happening that are the authentic self
Yeah.
that need to come to completion in order for the self to be around or authenticity to be there all the time. And authenticity is informed by emotion, which emotion allow us to know what our needs are, know what our wants and desires are. So people are doing things. That's why a lot of people get sober and they, join the circus or they do things that because they still don't know what they want. They think that it's out here that
Yeah.
will solve what's happening in here, but they terribly miss themselves and they don't know it.
Yeah. So
And
tell me more about authenticity and what you mean by that. And guess you don't mean a nice quote on Instagram. You're meaning something else. What is, from a psychological, relational perspective, what is authenticity to you?
authenticity is all the spectrums of emotion.
Okay.
And typically people are operating in a default, which aren't, it's not really the self.
Yeah.
And that inauthenticity creates all the suffering. That was what was happening in early life to adapt to the caregiver to avoid relational loss. And so now today it acts out in these relationships to work and to love are usually kind of the biggest problems there.
And
And so
would you see those adaptations on some sort of spectrum with disassociation, for example? They're
absolutely.
aspects
That
of
this
disassociated self.
Yeah, yeah, when somebody gets sober, they can barely embody themselves usually. That's why they, go 100 miles an hour on their motorcycle or eat a lot or gain a lot of weight is because they need dissociative substance or intensity or shutdown to relate back to their family system because it's too painful to be who they are.
Yeah.
And so when I talk about authenticity, they start experiencing in the model in the session, we get into a little bit of chop. It's kind of like taking off from, London Heathrow and you hit some clouds. And it's like this is what wasn't completed that are the difficult emotions, or you might feel the difficult, but they're actually beautiful.
Yeah.
But beyond that, you punch out of the clouds, you're in the open sky, and people are like, what is this?
And
And it's like,
self-functioning is interesting because it's a contradiction, isn't it? Self doesn't exist without other. And if the other isn't available because you're defended against it, how could self exist really would be the philosophical question. And that would lead to an existential crisis, what people might call the hole in the soul or whatever it is. But there's some sense of catastrophic collapse. Yeah.
exactly. And I think, Bill Wilson said it best where he said, Tony A, the guy who created the ACA movement, always quotes Bill Wilson saying this is really not popular in recovery. I think the archive might have gotten rid of this.
Yeah.
Basically, Bill Wilson said, I made a huge mistake when I created Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I designed it for the biological alcoholic purely.
Yeah.
And he said, now what I'm seeing after many, many decades is most of the people in AA, yes, they might have a biological predisposition, but they're mostly socialized for it. And then over here is a large mass of humanity, which is most of AA, which is purely socialized for alcoholism, which means it's in the family. And so he said, I would have been better to create a fellowship called Neurotics Anonymous,
Yeah.
that these folks have internalized their folks' neuroses and they don't know how to get out of it.
And it comes back to the other point I make. I think there is a significant problem with the core text being something written by a guy who really didn't know what he was talking about. Did some
Right.
great work, but the text needs to be updated and the model needs to be updated. And I think in practice, most people do update it, but they're not honest enough to say in meetings, because you get shot down and stuff like that. But guys like you are updating it. And I think in that valuable tradition of inquisitiveness about these issues, and we need to remain, I think, inquisitive and interested. And we also need to remain rooted in the here and now and the scientific developments. I say to people like, okay, that's fine. The Wright brothers invented the aeroplane, but given a choice, do you want to fly in that aeroplane or do you want to fly in a modern jet? I think I'll choose the modern jet, whilst also
Absolutely.
recognizing the biplane with string and all that sort of stuff. Thanks for that. But actually, I prefer this way of flying. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of thing. And I think I'm right. I remember some quote from Bill. I don't often quote Bill because I dislike him, but like, or what I think of him, I dislike. The construct I have in my mind, I dislike. But there
Uh,
was something in 1965 with him quoting the biggest problem we have in this movement now is people have turned into a concrete reality as opposed to, he didn't say it in these terms, as opposed to a relational reality. We've constructed something called the 12 steps, which people pray to, and that's not the point. We can't be like that. So Having said that, the 12 steps have been adapted a lot, and I think it's a very valuable model. Certainly helped me, etc. So I'm not putting it down. I'm just suggesting that live here and now, folks.
Right.
It's a
Well,
much more useful place to be, I think.
I think that why it's a default is because the social model does work in terms of the connection,
Yeah.
so having people co-regulate you, even if they're extremely dysfunctional or whatever, that connection is connection. And so it's really helpful in that way. Um,
Absolutely, absolutely.
but the internal reorganization, I think in 2013, when I started working with this, and when I started developing the model with Dr. Heller over the years, is the biggest points of it is identity,
Yeah,
shame, agency, and attunement. Those are the
yeah,
that we actually, when Dr. Heller created this, he created this model so therapists don't burn out. That's why he created it, because the less I do in the session and the more I'm in tune with the patient, the more room there is for them.
yeah. But I guess it's also there is an emotional presence, so it's not a blank screen and that's just creating anxiety in people. You're actually present with them.
I'm just noticing to help coordinate with them.
Right.
So I'll be like, your lip just kind of twinged there. What's happening?
Okay. Okay.
And they'll be like, I don't know. And I'll say, okay, so what's happening when you notice? So confusion is a big
Yeah.
moment when we know we're hot on the trail.
Yeah.
Or if they say, oh, that's weird.
Yeah.
Or when I do this, it's weird. I can tell that they're getting ready to start to individuate
Yeah.
from the family system.
Yeah.
So the more confusion, the more they're saying this is so strange. They're experiencing another phenomenon. Then I know we're actually making ground.
Okay.
And as soon as they start to hit authenticity, it's interesting. The moment that they hit it, they want to stay there all the time. It's
So
just
they
like
enter that strange situation where they have to adapt in a healthy way. A bit like the strange situation with the child. I've got a safe space to go and check out now. Who is this person? Who is this new experience? Let me find out about it. And using that sort of internal sort of roadmap. You mentioned the family system. In your work and in the model, are you working with the family system as an actuality where possible, as opposed to just the internalized system in the individual?
no, I don't. I don't really work with families. I work individually for them to go into the family.
Okay.
And so in each session, we expand that capacity, although there's contraction. It ultimately keeps expanding. But I do work with couples, and I have worked with families in the past, and I've used this. And what I often do is, one person is the problem, one person is kind of tired of the problem, whether it's the child or the husband or wife or whatever's happening. And what I do is I just do the individual NARM with them.
Yeah.
And all they do is they see what's really happening in their partner,
Right.
that they foreclose from themselves and from the partner. And when that partner witnesses and there's that understanding of what's happening, that's where change happens, or that's where authenticity starts to happen.
Yeah.
And so when they hated that thing about that person, all of a sudden they have the deepest compassion because they can appreciate the strategy that their partner has, and it protected them. But now, yes, it is standing in the way.
Okay. Okay. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time. I thought it would fly by and you wouldn't
Oh,
notice because we've been enjoying the conversation. I do want to get to a point, if possible, if you can just let people know, like in headlines, what would they expect if they were to ask for a service from you? What typically might it be in terms of intake and assessment, process of therapy, how long it might be, what are the components involved, etc., etc.
sure. I mean, when I'm working with somebody in an addiction treatment setting, I have somebody that kind of takes all the information
Yeah.
because when they come into the NARM session, they sit down and all we do is we start by saying, what are you most wanting for yourself, or what is the deepest intention you have for your life?
Yeah.
And oftentimes they're kind of in this story. And so they go into that cognitive based story. And then I come back to they're often telling me what they don't want. And so what I do is I kind of bring them back to, again, what is your deepest intention for your life? What do you want? And so that's where they're often disorganized, is because they don't know what they want, because they don't know how they feel, so they don't know what they need.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of unmet needs. And so we start working on that.
Okay.
We start working through what's called the first pillar, which is connection. So we get that first thread of connection to themselves, not to me,
Yeah.
but to themselves. And then from there, we move into what's called, sorry, just a second. I have to look at my notes here.
Yeah, go. It's fine. Take your time.
Yeah, you might want to edit this. So,
No, we'll just leave it as it is. I mean, it's authentic, right? It's genuine and real. This is what happens.
right, right.
Absolutely fine.
So I say this thousands of times a year, and I
I
can't think
know.
of
I
it.
know.
So there's connection, and then we start moving into trust, agency, and then later on healthy sexuality
Yeah.
and basically intimacy, because that's our biggest drivers, our sexual force in the world, that our intimacy coupled with our sexuality is humongous.
Yeah.
That libidinal force is what powers us throughout our day. And so working through that model, that's to me is reorganizing attachment.
Right.
So it's working through those things that when I don't look at it as a regression, I look at it as contraction
Yeah.
that leads to expansion. That when they come in, they're like, they want to attack themselves. And so I allow them. I was like, of course you would want to attack yourself.
Yeah.
That like that's okay. Like even if you have to attack yourself, can you notice that and love yourself through that? Not like I'm cheerleading them, but just kind of like supporting them to understand what's happening so that they can get to that kind of state of neutrality and kind of change their state.
So
And
being
that,
a loving, accepting presence in the face of the inability to love and accept is got to be a good thing, right? I mean, it like
well, yeah,
has to be
because
a good thing, doesn't it? You know.
it is because that's what the autonomic nervous system is it's automatic. So it's regulating and down regulating. People talk about regulating their nervous system. I'm like, good luck, because like it's very in charge. And so the whole thing is it starts calibrating once it can be in the presence of relational connection and start to settle down, then
Oh,
all of a sudden
I'm just going to
state
give an example clinically of what you're saying, just to back it up. I remember somebody that's been in our practice for over 10 years now, very successfully. But when I first saw them, they could not regulate, and so couldn't complete sentences, and had all these strange things that they would sniff, smiles, vials of smell and touch, and of course they couldn't function in the world at all. But now they have friends, and now they have good relationships with family. It's still limited, but that's really where it's at for them. It's not this strange arcane stuff. And I totally agree with you. If we're not equipping people, and I think it was Van der Kolk said something about that. He played a video of a British war veteran in a supermarket shop losing their temper with a child crying. And he said something very important, which is that, okay, we can do lots of therapy with this guy, but really he has to tell us what he wants. And if it's not improving his life in a way he wants, the therapy is pointless. It is
right.
a waste of time. It's
It
just clever
really is.
stuff. Yeah.
That's why connection is the first part. And so because it's hard, like you said earlier, that suicide or all these things are a child's fantasy that we all have that failure to thrive, that if our environment's failing us so much, it would just be easier not to be here.
Yeah.
Or if you're going to take my alcohol, it'd just be easier. So those like states of crisis or internal, that's how it felt back then to
Yeah.
have to choose between authenticity and adapting and keeping connection with a caregiver who was disassociated or abusive or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And so the lack of that quality of connection, when that starts coming in, the patient automatic or the client starts getting into this conflict. We call it the core dilemma in NARM-AC, where they feel like they have to choose between staying connected versus their authenticity. It puts them into deep state of conflict
Yeah.
and just sorting them through that and slowing it down
Yeah.
so that they can start to experience, things like rage and things like that because that's why working with anger and shame is one of the biggest things
But
because
I was just
it,
thinking about shame because when you're describing this conflict, the mediator would seem to be shame. And it's
well it is it's
framed that
that
so somehow.
well if I'm being seen through the eyes of fear or hatred by my caregiver,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden I'll start to think what's wrong with me, and that
That's
hatred turns in on the
right.
self.
That's
Or I can act it out and deny them, or I can keep the connection and start to turn it in on myself. And
yeah.
that feels like I can keep that connection because um, you know I trust myself enough to turn that in on myself, and then I can control my caregiver by not disrupting them or not disrupting the connection. So I think that when people talk about depression, that's just rage turned inward.
Yeah.
That a little bit of rage or a little bit, let's even call it frustration, because if that's more palatable, if that's more acceptable, a little bit of frustration is libidinal force to move towards connection.
Yeah.
Just like a sunflower turns towards the sun,
Yeah.
at the risk of burning up, it turns towards connection.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think when people are talking about anxiety and depression a lot of times, which are down-regulated and up-regulated by substance or whatever, they're telling me that there's unmet needs. Okay, that's their anxiety. Their depression is all this rage that's turned inward. And so, when we start working at it in session, they'll be like, "Oh, I'm a nice person," and they're not authentically. They have a lot of anger. They're a kind person, but they haven't balanced out that all that repressed rage. That's why they can't get out of bed or motivate to do anything,
Yeah.
is because they don't know how to work with that shame and that rage, that the shame is just the psychological or psychobiological collapse
Yeah.
of all that frustration. That's why a child crying is it's a beautiful moment. Just like that veteran like tried to temper that because he couldn't deal with his own dysregulation.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
If I see a child crying at Whole Foods in the shopping cart, I think, or the basket, I think, that's it reaching for what it needs.
Yeah.
And although it might be a child's fantasy, like you could eat all the cookies, it still has the hope of doing that, where a child that shuts down after it cries after a long time, that child will have a harder life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We unfortunately are running out of time.
Okay.
I want to give you the opportunity to sort of let people know how they might get hold of you and your service, how they might engage with you either as a therapist or a service or the books. I think you've written a book as well, haven't you? So websites, social media presence. What sort of range of services do you offer in terms of training, speaking, therapy, etc., etc.?
Sure. Well, yeah, I do. I just got back from the UK, speaking for Harvard McLean.
Yeah,
So I do that. I don't really have a website. You could head to narmtraininginstitute.com,
yeah.
or if you
Okay.
Google NARM Training Institute, that's where all the publications are. Our book comes out I think it's next April. It's
Okay.
available in 17 languages. It's published by Penguin Random House. So you'll be able to get it there.
Well, I'll
I'm
ask I'll ask Teresa, my PR person who reached out to you, to get hold of you next year when the book is going to be published, and we can sort of then talk about it in more depth. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can come
And
back on.
if you want to go, mainly what I work on these days, I do take private practice clients sometimes.
Yeah.
If you want to, you can email me at james@mmhealth.ai. And
Okay.
if you want to head to mmhealth.ai, that's my company.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Look, it's been super exciting. I'm glad you came back. Didn't give up on us. You carried on crying and we picked you up. So that's great news. And really exciting for me. I can't tell you how exciting this conversation has been for me. Really authentic and some depth to it and some interest to it as well. And I love the work that you're doing. It's really exciting. And I think it is what's needed right now in terms of the conversation around recovery and treatment, which, has become quite ossified with models that are no longer that effective for the modern world, I don't think. And it's time for us to move on without a big argument, but just to sort of begin to integrate modern thinking, I think, into the practice. So it's been lovely to have you here. Do stay there for a second. Folks, I hope you found that as interesting and insightful as I did. And do join me for the next episode of the Wellbeing Show. But for now, I'm just going to say goodbye to you all. So goodbye, James.